Hello, I'm Alexander Rose, the Executive Director here at Long Now. I'm joining you from the Interval here in San Francisco, where I'll be joined by Adam Rogers, our speaker tonight, who is going to be speaking about the history and future of color and perception and culture. Adam Rogers was one of the very first speakers we had here at the Interval way back in 2014 on his last book, Proof, which was really a kind of a similar study, but on alcohol and culture. But tonight, he's going to be talking about both the science and history of color and perception and how it has affected civilization through time. Welcome, Adam Rogers.
Thank you, Xander. It's good to be back. I want you to picture, in your mind, the quintessential yellow. So not an object, not a yellow thing, not a lemon, but just yellow, not orangey, not greenish, yellow. Okay, you got it? Now, I don't know if this is it for you. This is how a lot of computers code like yellow. And of course it'll look different on every screen because nobody calibrates the colors of their screens and all screens are different. All things being equal though, and this is a little bit weird, the yellow that you would pick as perfect, as quintessential, if somebody shined a light and gave you the controls of the dials to pick a perfect yellow, is probably very, very close to what another person would pick. Of course, all things are never equal. We measure color in a lot of ways: saturation, brightness, intensity, and those metrics vary from place to place and time to time when we talk about color. Let's try another warm-up. Now I want you to picture your perfect green. So not bluish, not yellowish, green. Okay, you got it? Now here's a weird thing. The green in your head right now is almost certainly not the green that someone else would think of or would pick as their quintessential green. People vary by a lot. If you do that thing where you shine the light in their face and let them control the dials, it'll vary by as much as 60 nanometers if describing colors by their wavelength is your thing. This is a good green. It's fine. It's a little yellow for me, actually. But an important question to ask here, I think, is why would this green not be your perfect quintessential green? Because the blue-green region of what scientists call a color space, the entire multi-dimensional range of colors and variations in colors possible and perceivable, is a brutal place. It is a weirdish wild space. Now, partially this is because of how your eyes and brains work. Partially it's a function of your personal experience, of philosophy, of language, of all the green lights you've ever seen, every traffic signal, every green field of England, every blade of grass, every incredible Hulk. Color is physics. Color is culture. You probably remember something from elementary school called primary colors. And the idea of those is that you could have specific colors, or really, and we'll talk more about this too, specific names for colors that we agree upon, and then somehow try to understand how those colors mix and come together to form all the other colors, because of course color is a continuous sort of curve or waveform, I guess. There's red, yellow, blue. Those are the primary colors I was taught. There's red, green, blue. Those are the primary colors your computer was taught. There's the Munsell primary colors, which is a system of organizing color. This sort of unifies them all for comparison's sake. You can see how different they are. Around the outside is what Isaac Newton called the spectrum. The middle ring are the artist's primaries and secondaries. And the inner ring are the additive colors. Red, green, blue, shine light, put those together, they mix and form other colors, and the subtractive or reflective colors that you'd find in a pigment: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, CMYK. History is littered with the rubble of attempts to put colors into some kind of order, to make them behave so that printers and painters and dyers and weavers and digital animators and artists of all sorts and people every day can use them, can take this mysterious but ubiquitous feature of the universe and turn it into something that we change, that we transform, and that transforms us into a technology. So here's the hypothesis. When we talk about color, we are actually talking about three separate but related and overlapping things. So first is color that happens without us. The tree falls in the forest, it's green even if we're not there to see it tumble. That's physics, chemistry, the oscillation of electromagnetic fields moving in a direction. Electromagnetic energy streaming from the sun, hitting Earth's atmosphere, interacting, hitting other surfaces and particles. Light. 1.21 sextillion photons hitting every square meter of Earth's sunlit surface every second. Color is something that we make. Colored things by dint of our hands and our effort and our cognitive abilities. Roman purple, Egyptian blue, mauve. Colors that didn't exist on Earth or anywhere in the universe, maybe, until human ingenuity makes use of all that physics and chemistry to make them happen. Usually we call these things pigments. These are things that absorb some colors of light and reflect others, presenting a color to our eyes. The image that you see there are jugs full of quantum dots. Eventually those are going to be part of LED TVs. It's arguably one of the most advanced way people make colors today. And third, there's the color that our eyes and brains manufacture from those other two things. Light all around us bounces off or through or among surfaces into our eyeballs, where hideously complicated biological sensors transduce photons into neuroelectrical signals. The image that you see now is Ramon y Cajal's hand-drawn map of a mammal's retina. That comb-looking part up at the top are the rods and cones. Those are the photoreceptors at the back of the retina that perceive light and color. This is Isaac Newton's original spectrum with colors added later. He didn't draw the colors in when he did it. Famously, in 1665, he goes on the run from the plague and hides out at his mother's house, closes up the shutters of the study he's working in, pokes a hole in the wall, sunlight comes in, he lets that sunlight go through a then relatively new optical technology called a prism, and sees on the opposite wall colors splayed out in a line. The eyes and the brain don't perceive the same world of color that the universe creates. What we think of as color is like all the other senses, just an approximation. So, that first way of looking at things, this is going to be familiar to you. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. Colored light is, in one sense, just the teensiest part of the physics that surrounds it. And this sort of makes sense why it's that narrow band, because we're using meat sensors to perceive it. Longer wavelengths would cook those meat sensors, and shorter wavelengths would ionize them into little balls of cancer. We humans call anything between about 380 nanometers and about 750 nanometers, we call that stretch visible light. Those are colors to us. You can see here that the peak spectra of the three of them that most human beings have in their eyes. People call those red, green, and blue, or short, medium, and long wavelengths. But you can see that the peaks aren't well distributed, and the tails overlap. This is, like everything else in our meat suits, an evolutionary kludge. And in some humans, one or two of them doesn't work. Some rare humans have a whole other one of them in there, in between the green and the blue. They are tetrachromats, as opposed to most of us trichromats. But the wavelengths it responds to still fall inside the range of what we tend to call visible. But look at this. Birds. Birds are tetrachromats. They see colors way down into the ultraviolet. And bees, they're trichromatic like us, but they don't even bother with red. They're seeing the green and the blue and then ultraviolet. The natural world positively glows to these other animals. We can't even begin to imagine. I mean, we can begin to imagine, but we don't see what they see. They have other colors. And look at this show off. This is a mantis shrimp, 12 photoreceptors into the UV and near infrared, jerks. I mean, now, except for the colors out on the edges, most scientists don't actually think that the mantis shrimp sees more colors than humans. It might not discriminate among a zillion where we only do a cajillion or something like that. It does do it faster, the connections between those receptors and what passes for a brain in a mantis shrimp. I'm not trying to be offensive, but mantis shrimp. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that color is quite literally in the eye of the beholder. What colors we see depend on our biology. The cones sensitive to long, middle, and short wavelengths all do something called quantum catch. They're kind of adding up the number of photons they're receiving at the energy levels that they're sensitive to. This is a function of the proton structures around them responding to that energy. They aren't just sending red, green, and blue signals back into the brain. They're combining their signals with each other and with other kinds of neurons adjacent to them and other kinds of cells that are helping that process, doing complicated calculations within the eye. They're also doing overall number of photons to calculate brightness or intensity, because the amount of light and dark is part of the way we perceive color. And then that all reaches back. You can see in this diagram, those two circles at the top there are eyeballs. Everything else is brain. And once you get into the brain, what you would love to say is like, oh, well, there's like a part for red and a part for blue and a part for green. But no, it's not like that at all. The parts of the visual cortex may or may not map to specific colors, perceptions of colors. The neuroscience community has been arguing about this for decades. We don't even really know completely why we or anything else sees color at all. Clearly it's some kind of information. Clearly it's evolutionarily useful. Part of the answer might be here. If you're local to Long Now, you might recognize the salt ponds at the southern edge of the San Francisco Bay. Those colors come, at least in large part, from salt-loving extremophile microbes called halobacteria. Halobacteria aren't bacteria at all. They are members of the kingdom Archaea, the oldest life on Earth, 3 or 4 billion years old. Obviously, they do not see. They don't have eyes. They are 6 microns long. They have color, which means they have pigments, lots, in fact. And they also know how to avoid blue light and swim toward orange, which is weird because, again, no eyes. So halobacteria have a protein called bacteriorhodopsin. They're using it not to perceive light, but as a proton pump. They turn light into energy. But the thing is that while the overall structure of the protein is pretty close to ours, the individual amino acids that make up that protein are different. It's like making the same spaceship with different Legos. So no one knows for sure if our color vision evolved from their color vision, or if color vision is so evolutionarily valuable that evolution just comes up with it again and again, and over time, the same approach with different structures. Nobody knows. It's good for something. And we humans keep making our own colors to feed our appetite for it. This is Blombos Cave. It's on the coast of South Africa. It's been the location of a bunch of really exciting archaeological finds over the years. Some of the first ornamental beads, one of the first drawings the human beings ever made. Between 10 and 20 meters down, about 100,000 years old, the archaeologists who worked that cave found something remarkable. These are abalone shells. In the one on the right, you can see a little rock down at the bottom, and it's sort of molded to the shape of the inner surface, the nacreous substance on the inside of the shell. And you'll see also some reddish color there. That's ochre, an iron oxide. These are tools for grinding that ochre down, for mixing it with, they found samples of what's called trabecular bone, like you'd find in the spine. It's sort of fat and marrow and cartilage, porous and gooey. These are tools to mix all that together and make a pigment, to turn ochre into a paint. It's the oldest known example of human beings taking a natural material and turning it into colored stuff they can use. The archaeologists who found them, led by a researcher named Christopher Henshelwood, called these toolkits. Blombos was a workshop for making color technology. But by the time you have people painting, for example, the insides of the caves at Lascaux in the south of France, tens of thousands of years after what was going on at Blombos, you have a pretty wide palette. Now, this isn't obviously enough of a gamut to depict the entire natural world, but there's a lot of color there. You've got the ochres, there's some coppery stuff for green, the blacks are magnesium and carbon, like soot, that's easy because you've got fires. And sometimes you'll have something almost always calcium carbonate based for white. And it's enough to make some really striking image like these. These are from the simulated Lascaux cave that the French built just outside the real cave. But you can also ask, could the people who painted it also have had other pigments? And the answer is yes. Maybe they had a blue made from flowers or something. We know because they were humans that they saw color like we do. We don't know if they made colors like we do. I mentioned the color white a second ago. People actually argue about whether white is a color or not, an achromatic, something without color. One eminent color scientist called it this, though, the mother of all hues. To some extent, the history of the way human beings have interacted with color has been a steady or a punctuated progress of having more and more pigments and more ways of making things have colors. But throughout all that time, one of the most steadfast principles, you have to have something to make white, something to be a substrate that you can put other colors against, something that when you mix it can either make those colored things lighter or give them more opacity or make them brighter. So that essentially has been having to have a white pigment. White is one of the bases of the axis that you can measure colors and brightness by. It's been omnipresent in coloring Roman buildings. In the same era that it was making ceramic in the Tang dynasty, it was also became the basis for makeup that women there would wear, all the way up through those famous pictures of Queen Elizabeth with the sort of white cake on her face. That was all white. People really vibe on white stuff, though. Calcium carbonates include things like lime and also kaolin, which is the mineral that make ceramics and fine porcelain possible. People have tried to make white pigments out of all kinds of stuff, in fact. Partially, that's because you need it to mix with other pigments to lighten them and brighten them and make them more opaque. But white's actually tricky because where most pigments, as I said, absorb some wavelengths and reflect others, white has to reflect pretty much all of them, but not back the way they came, because that would be a mirror, basically. White is organized disorganization. It refracts every wavelength, every which way. For something to be white, the particles inside it have to scatter all wavelengths equally and efficiently. Water droplets suspended in air are very good at this. That's clouds. Protein and fat suspended in water is very good at this. That's milk. For most of human history, though, the big white was this, lead white. It was a component of makeup. It was a component of house paints. It was a thing that artists used. Of course, lead white was also scary because it was hugely toxic. And everyone knew. They knew since ancient Rome how toxic this stuff was. So much so, because there was so much use of it in the 19th century for industrial uses and for paint, because everybody wanted their world to have nice colors, that the hazards of it had become the incentive to invent the entire field of occupational safety. It was a mess, which means the world was open to a replacement. In the late 1800s, an engineer named Auguste Rossi came from Italy to New York, and he made kind of a business out of understanding titaniferous ores, especially because people were trying to mine iron out of the Adirondacks and make steel, and that was like 25% titaniferous. So at that point, most people thought that the way you would make good steel out of something like that was to take the titanium out. But in 1908, Rossi noticed that the chemical process he was using to purify titanium produced, as one of its intermediate steps, a fine, brilliant white powder. He mixed it with salad oil and famously brushed it across a piece of paper. This was a big moment. Rossi knew about the dangers of lead, and he understood the hegemony of the national lead conglomerate that was selling the stuff in paint. So he and his partner added a new business line, titanium dioxide pigment. That's the basis for all kinds of paints and coatings. It has a huge refractive index. It's opaque and it's bright. You find it even in coatings and paints of other colors. It's the main ingredient in a lot of those paints. You also find it in coatings of pills, some kinds of paper, almost every cosmetic in your medicine cabinet, sometimes in the white sugar powder on supermarket powdered donuts, because it's relatively inert. Used to be an Oreo filling. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry internationally. It drives a huge amount of business. The bright colors of modern art, of the industrial age, of streamlined moderne, that's this stuff. And it's everywhere, even today. Sprinkles and Sudafed and toothpaste. This was all part of what one historian has called a chromatic revolution. In order to make products seem new and modern, they took on new colors. And that started a kind of an interrelationship, a dynamic where new technologies would create new colors, and those new colors would inspire people to create new technologies, back and forth. Even though there's some kind of crass capitalism involved there, the transition in a really weird but I think real way of Dorothy walking from Kansas into Oz, of a world that goes from being not black and white or sepia tone, because of course that's just the way people now will think about it because we're influenced by the way the movies looked, but colors that were more likely to fade and that were more likely to be earth tones, into something vivid and vibrant that we think of as the 20th century and now the 21st. And it was titanium dioxide, really, that was one of the things that made that possible. What didn't exactly change, though, and what's still kind of unclear, is how we talk about those colors. This is changing direction a little bit, but I want to ask you another question. Do you see the color blue in this painting? This is the painting Athena appearing to Odysseus to reveal the island of Ithaca by Giuseppe Bottani. It's a depiction of a scene from Homer's Odyssey. Those stories, or rather one specific read of those stories, sparked a tremendous controversy that an increasingly colorful world only made worse. Does everyone see the same colors if they don't have names for them? Or read that differently. What do you call the colors between the ones you know the names of? And what does that say about you and your culture and about how the brain works? Because color is a really good way to understand linguistics, which makes it a really good way to try to understand cognition. In 1858, 10 years before this guy became Prime Minister of England, he wrote a book called Studies on Homer and the Homeric Age. He pointed out that Homer never used a word that meant blue or green in the original. Sure, the sea might be wine dark and dawn might be rosy fingered, but what does that even mean? Gladstone had a hypothesis. The ancient Greeks, he said, didn't see color like we do. They didn't say blue because they couldn't see blue. That's nonsense, of course. They were humans, they had human eyeballs and brains, they didn't lack the blue photoreceptor or have different eyes that function differently than ours. And, maybe the ocean wasn't blue, maybe it was green or black. But most translators today agree that the Greeks were using color words just differently. Those were colors that meant something to them, that had what scientists call salience. You remember those color orders that I showed you? Plato's version of that went from white to black. And one of the primaries that he used was translated roughly to sparkling or brilliant. That was a specular illumination. That specular look was something that they valued. So that may be what the wine dark sea was all about. Still though, the idea that some people, other kinds of people didn't see color as well as nominally civilized colonialists did, that was a pretty sticky idea. So Grant Allen thought that he would test it out. Allen was actually one of the inventors of both science fiction and detective fiction. But Allen tried a cool experiment. He sent letters to, as he said, missionaries, government officials, and other persons working among the most uncivilized races. Not above a bit of casual racism was our Grant. He sent those all over the world, asking those people to ask the locals a bunch of questions. And the answer at the end basically was, yeah, they all see the same colors. They don't all have the same names, and sometimes they don't have some names for colors at all, but if you teach people the name in a different language, they pick that right up. People were seeing the same colors, they just didn't call them the same thing. It had something more to do with culture than with biology. This was all anecdotal, of course. What all this eventually led up to in the 20th century was a mutation of idea into what's now called linguistic relativism. Sometimes this is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, after a Harvard linguist named Edward Sapir and an autodidactic fire investigator, self-taught linguist named Benjamin Whorf. And the most simplistic version of the idea even defining this is controversial, but just work with me, is that the things that you have words for in your head are a limit on what you can actually think of and about. Language is thought. Like I said, color is a very good tool for thinking about language. So you can test this, or you can try. In the 1960s, two linguists, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, had noticed in their fieldwork that some languages had fewer basic color words, things like yellow and green, like I asked you to imagine up at the top, that didn't mean anything other than a color, than other languages did. Some languages had fewer than others. Why? They decided to do a more rigorous version of what Allen had tried to do with his letters. What Berlin and Kay tried to do was ask people basically which colors are which, what they're called, which ones are subcategories, what names do you have, and so on. And the crazy thing is, they found a pattern. They found that all languages develop color terms in a specific order, they said. First, they start with white and black, then they'll include a red, then you get either a green or a yellow, then you get both, then you get blue, and so on. It turned out to be pretty wrong. Under fire for potentially some racial assumptions, and also because they talked to people who were bilingual, so the languages would be overlapping, and a bunch of other things. They tried it again. They went big. They went not to bilingual speakers in the California Bay Area, but to informants around the world, dozens of different languages and places. And they found that what was going on was much more complicated and mannered, that languages tended to separate their color spaces into light colors and dark colors, and then develop more words as needed from there. What we're talking about here is something called categorical perception. It's the ability to distinguish among stuff and name that stuff. So having words for things really does matter. This is just a small example, but Russian speakers have two basic color terms for blue. They have a light blue and a dark blue. I won't try to pronounce those because my Russian is, I don't have any Russian. So whereas we just have blue, they have two. If you show people those colors and then one of the other ones, so a triangle test, two of one color, one of the others, Russian speakers are faster at telling you whether the third one is the same or different than the others, than English speakers are. The hypothesis there being, the idea being that if you have the words for it, then you can see it more quickly. You can think about it more quickly. What you'd really like, though, if you wanted to try to separate cultural and linguistic influences on color perception from like innate biological categorical perception of color, you would want something that could see like a human, but didn't have language. So I recommend one of these. This one is mine from many, many years ago, and you can't have that specific one, but something like this. And seriously, no, for real, this works. You do what Anna Franklin at the University of Sussex did. You strap some 4-month-olds into car seats and make them look at colors. Because babies, if they see something unfamiliar, they look at it for longer. It's kind of a basic tool in developmental psychology. And you can tell what categories they distinguish between and which ones they don't. If something they haven't seen before, they look at it longer. If they've seen it before, it's already in a category, then they look at it for shorter. Anna Franklin tried this and found at the end, basically, that babies see red, green, blue, yellow, and purple. Before language, these are the categories of color. But what are the categories for? What do they mean? In 2017, a couple of researchers, Ted Gibson, who's an information theorist at MIT, and Bevil Conway, who's a color vision researcher at the NIH, and sort of my guru in all of this, they tried the same kind of show the colors game with speakers that the Berlin and Kay folks had tried, with native speakers of English, Spanish, and Chimane, which is an indigenous language in South America. This shows which modal terms or basic color words the speakers of each language used for Munsell chips. It shows that Chimane had fewer speakers had modal terms for those colors than Spanish or English did. But then they tried something new. They played a sort of guessing game. They would take the color chips and try to see how long it took people in each language to describe a given chip, to explain which one they meant to a person they were talking to. And the idea was that if you had fewer words to do this, if it took less time to do it, that meant that the color was somehow more information efficient in the language that you were speaking. So these are from the top to bottom different languages, English at the top, then Spanish speakers, then Chimane speakers, and right to left, information efficiency. It doesn't really matter which specific colors do which, because you can see what the overall divide is there. You can see that there's a division between what someone who's an artist, like Conway is, would call warm colors and cool colors. So there's roughly the same difficulty conveying the idea of the same colors. But in both, colors in the warm, longer wavelengths are the ones that are more efficient. Why are they more salient? You can tell as many evolutionary just so stories about that as you want, but this is sort of clear proof that at least they are somehow. Okay, so what's next? That's how we make colors and think about colors now a little bit. But because of that relationship between technologies for making colors and thinking about them, this is all changing. A couple of years ago, I went to a lab at MIT researchers named Liang Shi and Michael Fauché. They work with a 3D printer to try to basically forge paintings, not for criminal reasons, but what they're trying to do is print paintings that look indistinguishable from the originals, no matter what color light you look at them under. Now that's a big deal. The way the eye and brain remap the colors that we're seeing to account for the color of the surface, the thing that we're looking at, but also the color of the ambient illumination is a vast mystery. Nobody really knows how the brain does it. And what they wanted to do was create a printout, essentially, of an image that would look the same under the same kinds of different lights as the original. So to do it, they kind of reached back into the past. They took a process called halftoning, putting little dots of color next to each other to make color printing. That's how color printing works. Familiar if you're a fan of comic books or magazines or neo-impressionism. But instead of limiting themselves to cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, the classic colors of magazine publishing, they added a bunch of pigments: red, green, blue, violet, orange, even a titanium white, of course. They used a machine learning algorithm and told it to look at colors that it saw in the world and figure out how they changed under different illumination, and then come up with print the same colors that the originals. They were able to pull it off almost completely. That's an original on top, and then the copies are below. Basically, every scanned pixel of the original gets a three-dimensional like hyperspectral reflectance map that the computer then recreates with pigments and the 3D printer, multiple layers of 3D printer. Now, there's some kind of color physics going on there that figures out how light interacts with surfaces, but nobody knows what that physics is. Shi and Fauché don't know. They left it to the machine algorithm, so they don't know how it works either. The computer is able to make fake colors that nobody else knows how to make somehow, and nobody has yet asked the computer. One of the things that the color scientists that I talked to were most excited about were the possibilities less of like high resolution screens and more of wider gamuts. So the color gamut is what colors are able to be shown by a screen. And the idea isn't that you'd be able to show colors that people can't see, but to capture more colors that they do see out in the world. So right now, if you have a screen with too narrow a gamut and you try to show a sunset, let's say, you won't, it'll like cover up the colors that it can't depict. So everything will just look like the same yellow instead of a bunch of yellows and golds, let's say. So a color gamut, a wider color gamut, is part of what new and oncoming standards in high definition TVs and digital televisions will have. But they were actually more excited about high dynamic range. And dynamic range is a different axis in color space. It's the light to dark axis, not the colors, the actual hues. And if you can increase that axis, if you can make the dark super dark and the bright super bright, you can show more colors, you can expand the gamut. But also, some people think that you can even get more like emotional range. There's a researcher at Dolby who studies neuroscience as well as how to make better screens. And she says that if you have really, really super high dynamic range and you like look at fire, for example, that your skin will respond as if you're seeing heat. Pixar animators use the 6 primary color laser projectors of Dolby high definition digital cinema and the ultra high dynamic range ramp from bright, bright white to black, black, black. And they're doing experiments with inducing after images, using really bright colors to induce the after image that's the complement of a color so that you'll see colors that aren't really there. More colors and colored things are still coming. Every time people learn new color science, they use it to make new color technology. Like these are all samples for possible paints for cars. And the way you do this is you include in the paint mica, little flakes like cornflakes, and they reflect light in different directions and different amounts of light in different ways. So you get the sort of, when you move around the car, it's red over here and green over there. But mica actually comes with a lot of impurities. So they're trying to use artificial synthetic mica, maybe Vantablack, nanoscale, nanostructure black, that's the blackest black ever known. Or maybe what you see here. This is work from the researchers Jin-Gyu Park and Ben Rogers at Harvard. These are structural colors. They're not made from traditional pigments at all. They're nanoscale structures, tuned beads of styrofoam, actually, that reflect light mechanistically rather than chemically. I don't know if you're an entomology fan, but a lot of beetles have really extraordinary carapaces. The armor that they have, some of them's really specular. It looks like metal glowing. And there's one called the Siphoculus, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, that's ultra bright white, brighter even than titanium dioxide is. And it does that not because there's any white pigment in it, but because the way that the nanoscale, the way its armor is structured. And after that, I don't know, because Of course, no color is impossible. There's no missing shade of blue. Even if the ones that we can see are limited by our own biology and our own neurology, the colors that we can make are probably not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was fantastic. And I'm really glad that you're able to join me here at the Interval in San Francisco for some live questions. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm always happy to be at the Interval. It's nice to be back.
Excellent. Well, this is a fantastic talk, and I love how kind of first principle it is, and it makes you question everything you kind of know about, the way you perceive the world. I mean, your last book that you spoke here on was on the history of alcohol and culture. This is a pretty big departure from that. So, like, how did you end up down this path?
I know everybody. I have some bosses who wish I would stick to a beat, man. I think I've only written about obsessions. I had these two twinned obsessions, and I got one out of the way. But even before I started thinking about the booze book, I was thinking about colors and trying to understand. I mostly started a couple different ways. I actually went back and realized that my 8th grade science project was about how the eye sees colors, and I did a poll of my class, just like showed them colors and asked them to name it. Tried to do the Berlin and K thing with my classmates. They all saw the same, right? But I about 20 years ago, I got kind of obsessed with titanium dioxide, and you probably saw me starting to get all emotive and glow about this. Like, why would anybody care about this one particular molecule, this mineral? But I got obsessed because it's ubiquitous and it's hidden. So if we look around the room that we're in right now, almost every surface that humans have colored has some of that in it. It's in the paper, it's in the plastic, it's in the paint, it's in coatings, and I was just really struck by that, like that there was stuff, that there's a thing transformed by human hand, by Technic, that makes the world look the way it does, and that's not immediately visible, but so visible all at once. And I started doing what reporters call collecting string. I just started collecting files, and those files got bigger and bigger and bigger until finally I sort of thought, okay, I think I can finally tell this story. And that story became the story of color and technology together. That story became the story of how human beings see and make colors, because it's almost a structural problem. If I wanted to say titanium dioxide makes this really interesting white, then all of the other questions that the front half of the book has to answer kind of flow from that. You go, well, what does seeing white mean? What does white mean? What does make mean? What do all the words in that sentence actually mean? And those all become chapters.
Right. Indeed. And I mean, you mentioned how certain cultures have maybe one or two more words for a color that helps them distinguish them. There's I think, largely apocryphal notion that people who live in Arctic cultures have many more words for snow. But do they have more words for white? I mean, you mentioned this place that we're in. I mean, I remember picking out the white for the interval here. And, obviously, I think the one that we ended up is called Frank Lloyd White. And so, people who make paints clearly make up a bunch of names, eggshell or whatever it is, for white. But besides the current marketing efforts of paint, was there cultures that had, that worked that were out at the ocean that had many words for blue, or Arctic cultures many words for white, or jungle cultures that had many words for green?
There are many cultures will have basic color terms that may extend past the ones that Native English speakers, like I am, might have. I think for the whites, I don't remember any that have multiple basic color terms. I'm using this term of art, basic color term. The basic color term is the things that Berlin and Kay were really interested in, linguists are interested in, because they're the words that don't mean anything else. So not turquoise, because turquoise is the color of turquoise, right? So there's an object metaphor problem there, but blue, and not modified, like a light blue. Words that only are the metaphor for the color themselves. And I don't remember a lot that have a bunch of whites. I mentioned in the talk, Russian has a couple for blue. Japanese has some really interesting ways to express greens, because it doesn't have a straight ahead, or at least for a long time, until some more recent contact with Western cultures. It didn't have a basic green term, but it had some terms for the green of a younger green shoot on a plant. They
Right.
repurposed the word from melon into an adjective, or they were using them. And again, these are blue and green are often the space where this happens in a lot of different cultures because well, I say because like people are sure, but a lot of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and color scientists think that it's because the blue and green colors are, there are a lot of individual variation in the receptors, how many receptors people have and how they're distributed in the back of the eye. And, there's some variation in the way people's lenses will deal with chromatic aberration in blue lights. As we get older, we see blue a little bit differently. So there are a lot of things that change with blue. That tends to be the weird color space where things get
Right.
strange.
Well, I mean, I love how you brought up some of the old cave paintings. I went to some of those sites, and personal passion of mine as well. And what was really interesting to me was trying to determine if the colors that we're seeing 30,000 years later are those the colors that were used? Are we missing a bunch of colors that that faded? I know they're in the caves certainly helped them, and then also going to the Egyptian sites where they were protected. These brilliant colors that have survived 4,000 or 5,000 years. But it's always I wondered, do you know if they found chemical evidence of other colors that we're not seeing in Lascaux or these other kinds of sites?
Not that I know of. There are the chemical analyses of colors on these kind of on cave walls or rock walls. They do the chemistry on what those pigments are, and I haven't seen any work that's like, oh, we found traces of an organic, flower grass.
Titanium white, yeah.
Yeah. Although there is some good archaeology on the Inca having titanium white like 400
very
years
cool.
before Rossi invented it, which is a whole other weird.
What was the white that the Egyptians were using? They used a lot of white.
They did. They were using calcium carbonates and some leads, but primarily calcium carbonate based whites. Those are the accessible ones, the mineral whites. The problem that calcium carbonate whites have problem. I mean, obviously they worked great, but they're in comparison to a zinc white or a titanium white, they don't have as good coverage, so you need more of it. Refractive index is lower than a titanium or a zinc or a lead white. I mean, lead white was the big advance. It does everything that we want it to. It's just got that problem with the neurons.
It's just your children and all. Yeah. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the human tetrachromats. And I think we've talked a little bit about this. And are they the super tasters of color? Do they get more than I do? I mean, maybe I'm one. I don't even know. I don't know how to test for it. But are they? And then there's also the colorblind humans, and they kind of have other types of high contrast superpowers. Where do these fit in? Why do they? Do we evolutionary understand why we have these people?
It's great that you use the analogy of a super taster, because that really does try to get at the problem. The question that we're asking is about trying to attach metaphoric meaning to these words, right? So the equivalency that one might draw if a person had an extra photoreceptor, a fourth kind, making that person a tetrachromat, or putting them in some way, like birds, have those 4 photoreceptors, or the mantis shrimp with the 12. Would they see more colors, like see colors out at the edges, or are they distinguishing more finely among the colors that we already see? So where you and I would see the same blue, our hypothetical nominal tetrachromat would see 2 different ones. Would say, oh, obviously those are 2 different colors. And so that those people do seem to exist. Our own ability, even as trichromats, humans, that we're like weird among the primates. Even the primates don't really do that. And the evolutionary just so story there that you would tell would be to say, well, if you're a predator hunting, especially during the day, like the big giant reptiles were, like the dinosaurs and stuff, then it's really good to have really high grade, high definition color vision. And you see that even today in their descendants in the birds, right? And like raptors having really good vision that way. It's finely grained and good colors. Whereas you're descended, as we are, from the little nocturnal furry things that were scurrying around between their legs at night trying to stay out of their way and maybe find some bugs. You don't actually need color vision because you don't really have a lot of colors to see at night. It's good to have night vision. So you see that in some of our fellow mammals. But it's only a mutation in one of those receptors that kind of doubles up, makes a new receptor that has a slightly different peak sensitivity, that the spectra that it sees are slightly moved over along that along the sliding scale of what we we call the visible spectrum, that then humans and primates that we're descended from recapitulate the trichromatic color vision. There are researchers who are working on using genetic techniques to give primates that don't have all three photoreceptors as we do a third one to see if they then see colors the way human beings do. And there's some indication that they might. That work has been going on for a long time. Color blindness, the human beings with non-standard color vision, were actually one of the beginning touch points for how scientists figured out how color vision worked at all. The chemist John Dalton, who invented the idea of the atom, Dalton was himself colorblind, and he was from Manchester, which when he was growing up was becoming the center of textiles as part of the Industrial Revolution. And part of textile work was having a lot of different dyes and pigments to make these textiles different colors. So he started collecting different bits of thread and stuff and saying what color he saw when he looked at it, and finally wrote about that. And had donated his eyes to the local museum to see if they could look through it and see if colors look different if you looked through the back of Dalton's eyes.
Wow.
They're still at the museum. You can go and check them out. You can say, like, I'd like to see Dalton's eyes, please. You can't see a difference. But it was work like that. There was some theoretical idea that you could take what Newton had described with this range of colors, and even his basic color terms, his primaries are sort of arbitrary as well. He was trying to match to the alchemical and Platonic octave, and so he named all these colors certain things. But like if I look at a rainbow or a spectrum, I don't actually see those as well as Newton said that he did. But people were trying to figure out, well, how does one color get to another? How do they mix? How do the colors of light mix into another color, forming metamers? How do pigments mix? And sometimes they make new colors, sometimes they just get darker. These were all sort of mysterious things scientifically. So Thomas Young figured out that because he was interested in oscillation and wavelengths of sound, figured out that there was some overlap with what Newton had been talking about. In 1801, I think, gives this bravura series of lectures over the course of a few weeks, saying, like, actually, all you really need to see all of this range of colors is you really just need three receptors. You didn't call them receptors, but you just need three elements in the eye that you can combine in different ways. And you'll be able to see, if you have more of one and less of the other two, or more of two and less of one, that you'll be able to see this whole range of wavelengths that he had done frequency calculations for that really matched Newton's calculations pretty well. He died pretty early. He was a savant scientist and actually went on and helped Champollion translate the Rosetta Stone, in fact. But it was James Clerk Maxwell then who comes in and gets really interested in the same work. All of these folks have been training in using things like spinning tops and mixing pieces of paper like origami folds so that they could mix amounts of colors and see how they mix together and see what color somebody would see and say, like, oh, well, if you have 30% more blue, this is what color people perceive. Again, all working with people who were colorblind, who did have color vision. It was different than most human beings do, to try to figure out, well, what's the difference and does it help prove our point here? What Maxwell finally did, this is a great experiment. He had a device that could shine different colored light into people's eyes and tune it a little bit like the experiment that I was describing, that I try to imagine what your favorite yellow is, what the best yellow is. He could do that with different colors and use it to create a triangular color space where he would put red, green, and blue at the vertices of a triangle, and then the way they mix together would be along the sides, and then the way all three colors mix together would be how you color the inside of the triangle. And he did this experiment where he showed people a specific color, people who had some form of colorblindness. He didn't know there were a bunch of different forms of colorblindness at the time. He would show people a certain color, and then he would show them other colors and ask them what they saw, what color they saw versus what color it really was. And it eventually saw that you could plot those, and they would make a line. You could draw a line through them to one corner of that triangle. He realized, like, oh, that's the receptor that those people are missing, or that's not functioning in these people's eyes, that one receptor. And he realized not only did that show kind of how color blindness worked, but also that it proved that trichromatic theory, that most people, that almost all people, had those three receptors that could do the work through this very complicated neural calculation. It turned out to be much more complicated than anybody expected. This complicated, with just those three, that you can make all the other colors. And that's intuitive to us now, because people who are watching this on a screen are seeing a screen where all of the colors, the vast range, if you're looking at a UHD screen, vast gamut of colors, almost all the colors that the human eye can perceive, are really just being produced by three different colors of LEDs, and then sometimes a white one too.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And we're going to bring in one of the founders of Lung now, Kevin Kelly, shortly. The after this question. You showed a lot of history of color wheels and kind of that this science is littered by the bodies of people who tried to create the ultimate color wheel. But how far do color wheels go back? What is the oldest one that we know?
Well, so a lot of theorists, back as far as Plato, certainly tried to come up with an order, putting a color in order. The oldest one, there's a wonderful book called Color Ordered by a researcher named Rolf Cooney. I may be mispronouncing his name, I apologize. And the oldest one that he identified is actually a circle of vials of liquid that are different, that are either from clear through yellow to dark brown. And what they are different color, or urine. It was doctors using this color wheel to identify, like, well, how sick is this person? That's really dark brown.
Right.
Our friend is pretty sick. The thing I like about that the most is that you had to make it work, you have to have these glass vials, around basically what we call a boiling flask now in the lab, like the same kind of thing that's hanging up here at the interval with a lot of the people's personal bottles. And those are the same kind of vials that enabled Arab scientists in the Abbasid period to start to figure out how spectrum and rainbows work. So before Newton, that they were able to use to watch how light reflected through those before they had prisms, to try to figure out that, that light maybe refracts differently depending on what wavelength. We don't know what wavelength is, but there's different kinds of light that refract differently. And maybe that's how rainbows work. It was that kind of work that led up to what Newton was finally able to do in the 1600s.
Oh, very cool. All right, well, welcome on Kevin Kelly, who was the founding editor at Wired, as well as one of the founders of Long Now, and at Wired, where you work. Welcome, Kevin Kelly.
It's great to be here. Adam, I love your book and your talk. It's really great to have something that we take for granted kind of exploded and revealed to be as amazing as it is once we examine it. And you've done a great job in explaining that. There was a couple of questions from listeners. One, Jim Jenkins from YouTube says, is there a simple way to tell if a human is a tetrachromatic is there a test to tell whether you have this fourth kind of cone?
How do they test it? That's a really good question. I wonder if they're... See, the problem is there's so much individual variation already, so that if you went and got like the whole range of Munsell blues and put them down in front of you and me, there are probably some that I think I'm just trichromatic, that probably I wouldn't see a difference and you would too. So it's hard to do that kind of test without doing sort of the straight ahead genotyping. There must be a test. I feel dumb about this not knowing this, but there must be a test that you should be able to go and get. Isn't one of the home genome tests actually called color? You would think maybe they would.
But there must be some people who have maybe a more refined ability to discern colors that we couldn't. An ordinary person might not notice the difference between.
For sure, and this is actually one of the places where the color book overlaps with the booze book, because one of the things that research into people who are master sommeliers, so people who are very good at identifying wines, where they're from and how they taste, and all these fine grade variations. Research into what sommeliers are able to do often says that they don't actually have a better sense of taste or smell than what I might have as an untrained sort of just person who likes wine. But they have a lot more words to describe the things that they are smelling and tasting. And they can use those to apply to what they're doing. And then that gives them a greater range of a greater descriptive range, which is great. It's one of the reasons why when you go wine tasting, it's probably a good idea to not get the tasting words first. Before you taste something, get the tasting notes after, because it's really easy to incept people with those tasting notes, right? You can say you're going to taste the blackberry in this, and suddenly you taste the blackberry. Sure. Okay, so that's true in sommelier. I think that's also true in brilliant artists, or in people who are textile designers, or people who are doing mosaic work, that they may have they'll have a greater sensitivity to their possible range and have more words to describe them, and that gives them more access to being able to see these are different colors that I can describe. So it is possible that I might be able to see I guess those two blues are different, but that's just blue. I don't have a way to say that they're different, or they're so close that I don't even notice that they're different until someone comes around and says actually that one's a little bit more gray. And then I go, oh, right, of course it is. I didn't have access to it. And that's why the linguistics and cognitive research into color is so interesting, because it can kind of at least begin to reveal and get at those kind of differences.
So I want you to put your Wired hat on and think about the future of color. say 50 years from now, what do you think some of the new things in color technology might be? It occurred to me that one thing we're seeing is a shift from just reflective colors that have with pigments to these colors that are being generated from LEDs, and they're generated out. I'm sure there's a technical term for this. And I could imagine a world in 50 years where most flat surfaces are covered with some kind of screen and we're emitting colors, and maybe there's a way to make colors that we haven't seen before that way.
Sure.
What are you finding out?
What you're describing are a difference, first of all, between a reflective surface and an emissive surface, right?
Okay.
From an additive, from a subtractive surface or an additive surface where colors are getting beamed out, and that the transition from surfaces, it really comes along with electrification in a lot of respects. Having colored lights that exist independent of the light of natural light or light we get from burning stuff, has been one of the signal transformations in the way in the colors that people saw and the way people think about colors. One of the things that's happening now is there's some conversation about adding a fourth primary to color screens. So there's some science that says, right now, essentially they're red, green, and blue, and you can do some variations there. Or you can have, as some of the ultra wide gamut screens will do, have 2 reds, 2 greens, and 2 blues. And you can use that for 3D vision, but you can with 6 primaries, but they're still red, green, and blue. But there's a notion that you can have a fourth LED in the GRU space, in the blue-green space. And so instead of having the triangle of the gamut of vision that fits over all the range of all possible colors, you'd expand out to some quadrilateral shape that would then fit out over much more of the color space of all possible colors, and you'd be able to see more colors on the screens. But even then, what you're trying to do is really just match what you see in the world. The colors are already out there. It's just trying to get them to be artificially produced and beamed at us. But then you can also imagine like an e-ink technology is a reflective technology. It's not an emissive one. Those don't actually emit a lot of light. They reflect light. That's one of the reasons that Kindles, e-readers are black and white, right? So some of the work that I mentioned in the talk about trying to come up with structural colors using essentially polymers, like modifying polymers for their shapes and having different cores and different size outside to come up with a structural color that acts like a pigment. Some of that's aimed at coming up with e-readers and using less power for a screen. They're not bright enough to do that yet, but that could change it again. So we could be going back to, in some ways, an electrically controlled and electronically controlled, but not an emissive surface or reflective surface, and that would change again what colors we would perceive all around.
One of the clever things that Wire did in the first couple of issues was, in addition to the usual 4-color printing, we added day glow colors, which, my understanding of it, are pigments that take the ultraviolet light and use some of that energy to kind of boost up the reflective nature of the color, so you get a more intense color. And do you imagine things like that happening in the emissive color space, where we would be able to maybe simulate colors that we don't even have names for right now?
Well, this was some of the work that they were talking about, and they aren't doing this yet, but at Pixar, when they were talking about, for example, using the high dynamic range, ultra wide gamut, high definition digital kind of projectors that are now becoming more and more common in movie theaters and eventually probably in home screens as well, because that's sort of how this technology progresses. To be able to use the human eye and brain's tendency to see after images, totally well understood, but to sort of manufacture a color after looking at a color. And a famous example for this is like the Jeff Johns flags.
Right.
If I may have just mangled the artist's name, I apologize. Like one of those famous paintings is the United States flag, but done in the contrasting colors, the complementary colors, so that when you stare at that, you look away and you see the flag in your head. So if you could do that with like these super bright screens, to have one scene, this is what one of the Pixar color scientists was talking to me about, that you could have one color be emitted in a super bright form in one scene, with the expectation that when the scene transitions, you'll see the complement in the next scene. So the color won't actually exist on the screen; it'll only exist in our mind. Right? That'd
actually be a great test to sort out the robots from the humans, because the robots wouldn't work that way. You're not seeing that? Oh, you're not human. So you spent a long time working on this book. Has doing the research, did it change how you saw the world or how you saw color personally? Did it impact you and change your mind from even when you first started writing it?
By a lot. I actually had I had a little bit of dorm room like existential crisis for a while, where after talking to enough researchers, especially after doing research on the dress, that whether people saw it as blue or white, and you talk to enough of those folks, and you get to the end of these interviews, and you kind of go, yeah, but it was blue though, and they sort of go, look, it's charming that you think there's any such thing as an objective color, but there really isn't. It's just surfaces and the way they interact with the quantum nature of the universe. And after hearing that enough times, you start to walk around, looking around like, oh man, none of it's real. Like it's all just a surface with photons bouncing off of it, which I finally like. That'll keep you up at night. I mean, I was starting to like really sort of get a little nervous about that. And like, no, you got to just own the fact that our think meat makes a world for us and we live in it, and that's okay. It's not just I didn't degrade into horrible solipsism. My partner at home is a weaver. We have a lot of looms and a lot of fiber and a lot of textile in our house, and I have a vastly greater appreciation for that work, especially because, and there are a lot of ways that that weaving and textiles prefigure a lot of the kind of math that computer scientists do now. But one of them is that when you overlap fibers, and this is, I only know this because I would come home and say, "Did you know?" And she would look at me and go, "Yeah, that's what I'm doing with the thing. I know that." That you're not actually mixing the pigments, you're not mixing the colors. They're sitting next to each other, and when colors sit adjacent to each other, they have all kinds of weird effects in your eye and your brain. They assume some of the properties of the complement of the color, and with weaving specifically, they begin to act very much like pixels. Because you make smaller and smaller dots depending on the overlap, and you can make patterns with those pixels. They don't use that terminology, but a lot of the early design that computer scientists had to figure out to make pixels work on screens, like anti-aliasing that early Macs used to do to make text look curved when they didn't have the resolution to curve it. Those are things that the weavers discovered a long time previous to that they had to do with the colors they were working with. So now the dynamic in my house of like what sort of color work is happening on a loom at any given time versus what I know about it and what she knows about it it's changed our hobbies for the better.
Well, that actually makes a little loop back to the Jack Kerr loom and the beginning of programming, and there's the pixel. So thanks for that little closing the loop. Great book. Thanks for the great talk.
I appreciate it. It means a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, we've had several questions from the internet, but one of the ones
I know those guys.
we know those guys. One of the ones, and it correlates to one of the other ones that I had when we first recorded the talk, is you mentioned briefly about zinc white, but it seems confusing that we don't like. Why didn't zinc white take off? Why was it titanium?
Cost, properties of the pigment itself, and also what happens when you mix it and try to put it on a wall. A lot of there's the visual properties of these pigments, and then also their straight ahead material properties. But you can still get, you can go to a paint store and get zinc whites.
Right.
They exist and you use them. And in fact, Vincent van Gogh often painted the same painting with different pigments to see how they would act. Mm-hmm. So you can read Van Gogh's letters online. It's a remarkable resource, actually. And he there are some letters that he's got to Theo, to his brother. Those letters are often him asking for money and asking to pay for paint. And in one case, he complains about the lead white and the zinc white that he's using, that I think it's the zinc takes too long to dry. He doesn't want to use it because it takes too long to dry. He likes the way it looks, but it takes too long to dry. So you think these very, prosaic's the wrong word, but these picayune factors that make one pigment more useful or less useful. I asked a woman who's at the Smithsonian who studies lead white and the history of lead white, why you wouldn't transition when titanium became widely available in the 1920s. Really, like why would anybody keep using lead white? And she said that the lead has has properties on the brush that were more pleasing to artists. It's called being thixotropic, which is one of the best words I learned. Where when you push it with the brush, it moves with the brush, but then when you take the brush away, it stays where it is. And that's really, that's something that if you're a painter, you really want, because it means you have more control. And so these are the kind of things that make one pigment have a life or be used in a different way than another might. Titanium, some people find titanium white to be quite cold.
Right.
To be too blue, I guess, or too much on the cold side. They want something warmer, and so you'd go to a zinc, and then sometimes when they're on walls, they'll turn yellow or they'll spall off if they aren't prepared properly, and all kinds of other issues like that.
Interesting. And one of the reasons I'm trying to think, why, you showed some of the archaea that have in some way color perception, and then humans clearly have color perception. But as we talked about with the World War II bombers, some of those were better at actually doing their job if they saw less color. But do humans have all this color perception for danger avoidance? Is it for hunting? Do we know where that is it so you don't eat the red berry or the red apple, as it were?
Right. I mean, one of the ways that color scientists amuse each other after in the bar at a conference is to go through the different evolutionary stories. But what's it for, though? Why is it there? It has to convey an evolutionary advantage. It has to convey a reproductive advantage, or a sort of sexual selective advantage. And in fact, this was the color of the morpho butterflies. Was the thing that Darwin and Wallace argued about. Was specifically they were talking about, well, why do these things have color? It doesn't convey an advantage. In fact, it may confer a disadvantage. There's some research on guppies in mountain streams in South America, and this is sort of famous animal coloration research, where the guppies will have different color. They're the same species of guppy, but as you move down the stream, when they're a shrimp that will eat the guppy, they have different colors that either are more appealing to a potential guppy mate, or less appealing, or like less visible to the shrimp that are trying to eat the guppy. And there's this balance. And so what you really want if you're the guppy is to have colors that show up in the wavelengths that the guppies see, but not in the ones that the shrimp sees, right? So some of the good theories are that we see colors because it's for sex, like all kinds of other stuff that we do that doesn't seem to have any other purpose, because it's it's important. But yeah, there's a possibility that it's because we're trying to find fruit in the forest. The fructivore hypothesis. You want to see the red fruit against the green trees. It doesn't really make that much sense because there's a lot of green fruit, and like a lot of our primate ancestors eat the green figs. So how does that help? You really want to be able to see shape. There's a hypothesis that it's a way to be able to better perceive emotional state. There are certainly primates that when they're at the peak of their fertility, then parts of their body will change color. When we unconsciously convey emotional state by changing color of our skin. If we have a skin color that you can see that, not everybody does. The range of human skin color is actually not that wide. It sort of goes from pink to brown with a little bit of red shade in it. But within that, there's a lot of dark light variation. But still, you can imagine like being able to see if someone was blushing would confer some evolutionary advantage potentially. These sort of stories are really they're hard to tell, and they're hard to listen to because there's no real way to go back and unpack the truth of them. As you say, it clearly has some value. It has an informational value. But people who see human beings who see a different range of colors have other abilities as well. This is part of the long-term. It's one of the arcs in the book is the long-term war between form and color. Since at least the Greeks, a conversation about this mostly false dichotomy between whether form was more important, the shape of things, which you really see by light and dark. Really, that's what we really mean, unless you're feeling them, or the color of things, and that really came to a peak with sort of the art criticism of the late 19th century, where there were people who were arguing, that color was more feminine and therefore somehow less. It was like a nonsense, completely culturally colored with a lowercase c argument, right? But until the Renaissance, if you had a statue, it was probably painted. If it wasn't painted, then you didn't. That just showed you didn't have enough money to get a proper statue, essentially. And it wasn't until like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci both essentially said, actually, we don't want to see any color on this stuff. It's just the form. That's the pure that's the purest thing. But that conversation is a truth and beauty argument. It's not a informational or reproductive or evolutionary value. It's you don't have beauty without truth or truth without beauty. The form and color argument are two sides of the same thing.
Right. And I mean, we're getting close to the end here, but one of the things that's interesting to me is you talked a little bit about the Pixar thing of how, they're actually, in a way, using I guess you would call it like a psychochromatic effect to create a new color, right? And but is the electrification has it been studied as electrification of societies and emissive technologies like televisions and computer screens and now cell phones? Is that changing at all the way we see color? Do we know? Is that affecting us?
There's a pretty good case to be made, and some people did study this. For example, in the case of the dress, I go back to this because I covered it because it was a big deal, because it really changed a lot of color science too. The fact that happened meant that there were sort of years of research that followed trying to figure out.
This is the internet meme of the dress.
Yes. And there's a case to be made there that one of the reasons that image created a rigidly bimodal color illusion, right? One where once you saw it one way, you didn't switch. Whereas with like illusions of form, the is it a woman or a duck or a rabbit or a duck, or is the cube forward or back? Those kind of illusions, they're bimodal, but when humans look at them, we tend to switch back and forth, right? We go, oh, it's forward, oh, it's back. And one of the weird things about the dress meme was that once your brain decided which color, you stuck with it. You sort of couldn't see the other one. After you look at it for a while, you can. I've started to be able to. Anyway, that's another one of those things where I got totally messed up when I look at it now. But sorry, I looped a long way away here. But the point I was trying to make was that there's a case that one of the reasons that happened was not just the nature of that color, but that people were seeing it on emissive screens. Everybody saw it on their phones or on their on their screen at work. Nobody saw the reflective image, the picture. There wasn't one. It was a picture taken with someone's phone. So clearly that had something to do with it.
Right. Would it have happened with the actual dress at a party?
Right. And the answer to that's almost certainly no. And part of the reason why is that if you were seeing, well, actually I might reverse myself on that. But if you were seeing that dress in real life, then when the thing happened that probably happened with that image, which is the person walked through a shadow, they would then walk out of that shadow and your brain would correct. Your brain would do the calculation and go, oh, no, that wasn't that. It was this. It's this. I'm looking at it now and I can see it in different circumstances and I can subtract the illuminance from the object. And I can do all the work of color constancy that I need to do. But in fact, some of the research on the actual dress, there's a researcher in England who bought it thing and put it in a gallery room and then illuminated it with LED lights, red, green, blue LEDs, so that you can adjust how much of each of those lights you're shining on it, but it still looks like normal light. So if you and I walk in the room, it seems like it's being lit by white light, but in fact, it's actually sneakily not white light. It's some adjustment of colors with the LEDs. And they were able to make people see that dress any color they wanted.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, it works on art too, like even art that you recognize. You can make any art do the Cathedral at Rouen, Monet's Cathedral at Rouen. It can look like, any time of day. That's the sort of thing where you start to go like, oh, maybe there's not it becomes the province of the philosophers, whether that object has a color, that surface has a color, or whether that color is created in a dialogue with our eyes and our brains and our cultural experience.
Right. I've certainly heard, when people talk about, paintings that were created before electrical light, that, if you're looking at them in anything other than sunlight or candlelight, you kind of aren't seeing them the way the artist intended. And it's an interesting question. One of our other questions is, when humans colonize other planets orbiting other stars, how will the local sun's unique light spectrum affect their perception? So, it's kind of all tied.
So one of my favorite things, yes, trying to figure out. In fact, there are researchers who study exoplanets who both use the color that reflects off of those planets to try to understand their atmospheres, because different atmospheres will show different colors as we look at those exoplanets, even the little tiny specks of exoplanet that we can see. But also, yes, trying to figure out, okay, well, these are planets that have an atmosphere with a different composition than ours. So that changes what kind of light gets through. They have a sun that's different than ours. So it's emitting a different spectrum than ours is. Let's say there are plants. What color are the leaves? what's that version of chlorophyll? What's that version of the pigments that are doing photosynthesis? Are they absorbing all of the light they can so they would look black to us? And in fact, if it was a human standing there versus whatever primate thing, whatever lemur-like thing that evolved on that world would have eyes that evolved under that sun in that atmosphere and would see those colors in a very different way. They would have a different range of visible spectrum in the same way that on Earth, a bee or a fish or a snake has a different visible spectrum than a human being does. And you have to take all that stuff into account. They take it into account on the cameras on the rovers that are on Mars right now. Perseverance has cameras on Mars that are designed to take into account both what the image that they see would look like to a human standing there, would look like if it was illuminated by Earth light, what it would look like if it's illuminated by Mars light, and this is sort of metaphoric because the researchers don't think about it this way, but they'll say this is what it would be, what it would look like to a Martian.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it reminds me of that one day that we had kind of ominously last year in the Bay Area when the fires were so bad that the sun basically didn't come up and everything was orange. And the kind of hilarious part of that was that when people used their iPhones to take pictures, the iPhones color corrected all the orange away. Right. So the only way to take a picture of it was with like earlier, non-software corrected things.
Then if the iPhone couldn't take a picture of it, it obviously didn't happen.
Exactly. Just like all my meals. Yes. All right. Well, I want to wrap up. Thank you so much for this. But the last question I want to ask you, last time you were here, Amir, 7 years ago, was with Proof, and now with this. And what is the next first principle-based project that you're going to teach us about?
Am I booking space for 2028?
Yeah. No, we're filling up.
I know it took me a long time to write, Xander. I'm really sorry.
That's not what I'm saying. This is long now. It was short. Yeah, I just wanted to. Are you working on a new project?
Yeah, I have some notions. Yeah, right. That's all I was trying to ask. Jesus, man. Yeah, I have some notions. That there was a Virginia Pulsar wrote a really good book called The Fabric of Civilization. That sort of was like, I was hoping that there might be a textile weaving thing there, and I think she wrote it. So maybe that's not going to happen now. I spent the last year covering COVID-19, and the thing that I've gotten really interested in there is sort of how to understand how science works and how science doesn't, and what science is supposed to do. Because so much of what has happened with this tragedy of this pandemic for the last year has, I think, come down to not being able to explain what we know, how we know it, how scientists know it, what scientists don't know, and then how to say that to people who don't have the same scientific background and knowledge, and the very basic philosophy of how trials work and how science works and how scientists come to know things has gotten, I've been really compelled by it. I've written a few things about that, and I think maybe there's something there too. I don't know. I've been staring at a screen every weekend for a while. I might just go look at some colors outside in the garden for a while.
Right. Please do. Well, thank you so much. And I can't wait to have a drink with you here at the interval after this Q&A is done. It's been a very long time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad to be back.
And I want to thank you, our audience with Long Now, and our members and our sponsors of this series, and looking forward to having you at our next talk. Thank you so much.